but one that can be approached in a variety of ways. And so I want to talk about a couple of approaches and asking, what are the best ways to study religion? Religion is studied in a variety of ways across a variety of departments in the university, from people from different backgrounds and different fields. But some of the ones we're going to focus on here are the major fields of the study of religion. So the first, again, these are not in any particular order. The first is people who study religion from the fields of theology or philosophy. Now, if you're coming as a theologian or a philosopher, what are the kind of things you would be most interested in knowing about religions? What are you going to look at? What are you going to focus your attention on if you're coming from theology or philosophy? Yeah, your focus is going to be on ideas. Right? What are the ideas? How does this idea relate to that idea? How do they transmit ideas? Right? The focus is going to be on the ideological component, the beliefs, the theologies of religion. Another field of study is what we might call ethnography or participant observation, anthropology here as well. If you're approaching religion this way, what are you going to be focused on, or what are you going to do to achieve your study, to find your answers? What would you be most interested in if you were an ethnographer, anthropologist? Right, you're going to want to observe the people, right, and observe them while being there, right. And so the participant observation of going to a worship service or living with a community. Right? The focus is on culture in anthropology and human beings participating in culture. And so the ethnographer watches or talks with people or takes part in different ceremonies or rituals. A third method in the study of religion is psychology. The focus on psychology is, of course, the human mind. How does religion relate to human needs? And so they're going to ask questions about motivations, experience, outcomes. Right? Are religious people more likely to be against alcohol? Are religious communities going to be more prejudiced than non-religious people? These are the kind of things that psychologists would be interested in studying. A fourth method is sociology. The sociologist is focused on social behaviors. How does religion, or how do religious people in a community interact with other people in a community? So, how do religions affect public policy? How are religions affected by public policy? How involved are religions in social causes? What's the economic makeup of a particular religious group? Usually with sociologists, there are a lot of numbers, right? Percentages. There's all sorts of things with statistics, but the focus is on society and social interactions. Those are some of the major ones, but other approaches, other methods could be used as well. Literary criticism. Right? While the literary critic would be kind of interested in ideas, it's more about a focus on texts and issues with texts. How are texts created? Right? How was this scripture created? How was this document that's important created? How are they transmitted? What context did the text develop in? has it changed and modified over time? Right? Did it start out this way and gradually other parts were added to it? How does that reflect the views of the group at different times? Art history, art criticism. We would also put in there music, architecture. Focus on those elements, right? What does architecture tell us about this group and what's important? What does the music tell us? How have these things changed over time? Religion has also been studied from a biological component or cognitive science. Cognitive scientists are focused on the physical brain versus the psychologists being concerned about the mind. What goes on in the brain? What parts are active when someone prays, when someone worships? And then finally, the last method would be history. Events, how are those events interpreted? What actually occurred versus what was said to have occurred? What kind of influence did different people have on different events? So religion can be studied from a wide variety of approaches and produces different results. A psychological study is going to look different than a historical study. A theological approach is going to look different than an ethnography. Now, hopefully, most scholars and most people that would be interested in studying religion are going to approach it and seek insight from a wide variety of fields, because those that only focus on ideas miss the practice. Those that focus only on the psychology miss the history. So this kind of very interdisciplinary approach. What questions do you have about the methods? Any of these we need to clarify? Let's move on into talking about some terms. Some important terms that will help us as we go through the semester. Having that shared vocabulary that helps us know what we're talking about. So trying to hit some of the highlights of important terms in the general, the broad. We'll obviously be talking about vocabulary within traditions as well. Belief, of course, is probably something that you don't necessarily need to have defined for you, but when we're talking about beliefs, we're talking about intellectual assent to certain propositions. Religions have propositions. There is one God is a proposition. Belief is assent to that proposition. Now, certain religions, predominantly certain types of Christianity, maintain that being religious revolves around having the right set of beliefs. For other religions, it's not as important. It's more about the practices. Another term used that you'll find in a variety of situations is the term myth. Now, as we're using it, a myth is a symbolic story that provides meaning. Often when we use the term myth in just kind of a common way, we're talking about something that's not true. But essentially what we're talking about is, for many people, the literal truth of a symbolic story is not as important as the meaning that it provides. Now, in some traditions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, for example, the historicity of the symbolic story is very important. Right? It's kind of very, Jesus actually walked the earth is very important for Christians, not just an invented story about Jesus walking the earth. But the myth, the symbolic story, provides meaning, because just a historical claim that Jesus actually walked the earth is not the important part to Christians. The important part is what Jesus represents and who Jesus is. But those myths, those important stories, provide ways of seeing the world, understanding people around you. What's a ritual? Essentially what we're talking about with ritual is a set of repeated practices that express meaning in the world. It's not just the practice, but the practice has meaning. We've already talked about how they're often connected with transformation, but it's also important to see that rituals are routinized practices. They are done routinely. But they have ultimate significance in contrast to a habit. Right? You might have a habit of brushing your teeth immediately after getting up in the morning, but that's not a ritual in the sense that we're using it. Right? We might talk about it being a ritual. My ritual is to brush my teeth after I eat. Well, yes, but in the context of what we're talking about, rituals have ultimate significance. They affect things larger in the world. Scriptures refer to a text or set of texts believed to be both revealing ultimate truths as well as being authoritative. You'll find a wide variety of approaches on the issue of Scripture. Some Scriptures are believed to be divine in the sense that they reflect or almost literally the words of God or God's. Other texts are considered Scripture because they reflect ultimate realities. It wasn't that God dictated this, but it was a true record of the experience. Ethics refers to guidelines on what is considered appropriate behavior and how to act in certain situations. So when we're talking about ethics, that's what we're talking about. Another very important term in the study of religion is the term symbol, which we've already addressed. The idea of this kind of visible representation of an invisible reality or concept. It could also refer to language that is used by people to describe those realities, or to the practices which are believed to interact with those realities. Some scholars of religion would essentially argue that everything about religion is symbolic, and it points to something else. Deities, of course, refer to supernatural beings, but in most cases, deities tend to be conceptualized as benevolent beings in some way. Those that are evil would usually tend to not be deities, but in some traditions you do find evil deities. Often the term God is used in place or as an alternative. Another important term in the study of religion in more modern times is the term agnostic. Essentially, the agnostic believes that it's impossible to know if there is any supernatural existence. There might be, there might not be, but you can't be sure about it. The term agnostic was actually not used until the 19th century. Prior to that point, there had not been a term to describe such people. Agnostic is different than, of course, an atheist. Atheism refers to a position that essentially says there are no deities, there is no supernatural, an entirely naturalistic view of the world. Later on, we'll talk about, is atheism religious? And again, that will kind of bring up some of the things that we've talked about here about how do you classify something as religious or not. Another important concept within religions is that of the cosmogony. The cosmogony refers to a model that sets out how the world works, sets out the meaning of reality. Now, the cosmogony can refer to how the world was created, or it could simply refer to how a specific society was created. But often the cosmogony is intricately connected with how people live their lives, sometimes without people realizing it. Cosmogony is different than cosmology. Cosmology is the study of the origins of the world from like the standpoint of the science of physics. So there's a difference between cosmology and cosmogony. Cosmogony would be, stories of how the world began. Last term that is important to recognize is the term cult or cultist. Essentially, this is referring to the system of rituals used by a group. So what rituals a religion engage in is their cult. Now, obviously, probably the most way that you've heard cult is discriminatory, derogatory towards certain religions, right? This is a cult. That's not what we're going to mostly use that term for. If we're talking about cult, or if you see Corderon talking about cult, or prothero especially, it's referring to that religious component. There are certainly other terms that we could add in here, but as far as general terms that are helpful in the kind of comparative approach that we're talking about, these provide us with a beginning vocabulary to talk about and to know what each other is saying. So we've talked about some of the challenges in studying religion. We've talked about different approaches to how to study religion. But how do religions look at outsiders? Is another kind of approach to viewing religion. And Corderon really kind of talks about this, especially in thinking about how do you as a religious person look at other groups, and how does that shape our study of religion as well as our own personal views? Some religious groups tend to be exclusivistic, that theirs is the only true religion and all other religions are false. Now, in some sense, we shouldn't be surprised by that. If you believe you have the truth, then you're going to tend to look at other groups as being wrong. That's kind of contrasted to the inclusive view or the pluralistic view, as Corderon points out, and that's this notion of all religions have some sort of truth to varying degrees, and all should be applauded, lauded. It's great that we're so diverse. Is there some kind of way to approach both in the kind of acceptance of truths of other religions while still claiming, but the one that's truly true? Is that possible? Well, most people today would say such an inclusive approach would be closed-minded and other types of pejorative terms used. But certainly we recognize, especially within Christianity, some very exclusive truths about the approach to God, about the importance of Jesus. But on the other hand, as Corderon does a really good job pointing out, that shouldn't kind of close us off to recognizing that there are truths in other religions, not to say that they're equally valid approaches to God, but to say there are places for cooperation, contact, discussion. So somewhere between inclusivism and exclusivism. A third approach, and the one that we find more and more in the West, is the secularist approach, which doesn't have to be entirely atheistic, but most atheists tend to be secularists in the sense of religion should not be in the public sphere. If you want to be religious, that's fine as long as you do it privately. Religion shouldn't have an impact on public policy, on the government, on how we live our communal lives in a particular nation. But it's very easy for the secular viewpoint to also be kind of exclusivistic. All right? That this is the only way to look at things. So, these terms aren't as concise or distinct as we might expect. The last area I want to talk about today is really kind of highlight, as I've mentioned before, the really useful idea that Prothero presents in the beginnings of his book. God is not one, of course, plays off of a rather pluralistic view of there being a unity within religions. Okay? This notion of God is one. And that God is one is, however he appears there is one God and he appears in different ways in different religions. But Prothero points out that there's quite a bit of difference in religion, and that having this view that they're all just saying different paths up the same mountain misses some key important points. First of all, religions, for Prothero, are meant to address a problem in human experience. There is something wrong. That could be, as we talked about, sin. But it could also be self-sufficiency. It could be illusion, right? Deception. It could be attachment. Right? So it's going to vary between religions, but a good way to kind of boil these down. What is the problem that this particular religious group sees in society, in the universe? And then in turn, what do they offer as a way to solve that problem? What's the solution? What's the path to overturning that? Whether that's salvation, whether that's submission, whether that's meditation, whether that's following the Four Noble Truths. They're each offering a different solution, a way to solve the problem. And that solution is often connected with a specific technique. There is some sort of core practice or practices that are meant to bring about the solution. And then finally, in those traditions, there is an exemplar, a figure who is to be followed. This is the person that provides the technique, the solution. We follow this person. We follow their example. What questions, comments, cries of disbelief? Well, then we'll go ahead and finish there, and on Tuesday we'll pick up with talking about Judaism, getting into Judaism and looking at the different types of Jews in the world.